You started. I was in some other things.
Yes, sir. You can introduce Dr. Mary now.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. And today we are going to deal with the management of pain. So we had introduction to pain in the last class. Today we will hear more about pain management with the WHO analgesic ladder. And step 1 and step 2 of WHO analgesic ladder will be taken in this class, along with uh, more details of neuropathic pain. So this session will be handled by Dr. Mary Abraham, who is a retired professor of anesthesia. And she was doing neuro anesthesia. Uh, Later, and along with that, she was also doing interventional pain management. But now she is mainly concentrating on palliative care. She has also written a book, Conquering Pain, and now she is in the process of writing another book. So we have a very good speaker who is talented in many areas. So welcome, madam, and it's over to you. Madam, please unmute yourself.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, now you are audible.
Clear. Okay. Thank you, Sunil, for those very warm welcome and nice words about me. Okay, I'm very happy to be involved in pain and palliative care. I basically am involved in chronic pain management and palliative care management. And I'm no longer practicing neuroanesthesia at the moment. So with these words, I would like to once again say that it's indeed a pleasure for me to give this talk for Pallium India, and so that more and more people come to know about the role of palliative care and how you can do the pain management with these people. So can I have the first slide, please? Next, please. Okay. The broad outline of my talk is I'll first basically go on the WHO analgesic ladder, and then I'll focus on step 1 and step 2 of the WHO ladder. I will be talking about the adjuvant drugs that are used along with the ladder, and also focus a little bit on the management of neuropathic pain. Okay. Next, please. So the WHO analgesic ladder. Now, this was formulated way back in 1986 when a team of experts met together and decided that pain management is a very important part of palliative care. And so they devised this ladder, which was basically over the last more than 30 years, it has stood the test of time. And even today, we are following this WHO analgesic ladder with a few modifications. But we are by and large following this ladder. And this has been translated. You can see the immense success of this ladder, that it has been translated into 22 languages, and it is basically used to treat cancer pain and of course other types of pain also, but mainly cancer pain all over the world. Next, please. So something about this ladder. It is a very simple ladder, very simple to use. It's well validated. That means it has been found to be effective in managing pain if you follow the step. Also, it is a stepwise approach to treat cancer pain, starting from mild pain to severe pain. So it's based on the severity of pain. The application of the ladder is basically based on the severity of pain. Before the ladder, there were a lot of people who were dying with unnecessary pain at the terminal stages of their illness. That is because there was a lot of hesitation in using the strong opioids like morphine and drugs like that. The reasons were because, first of all, there was a lot of drug regulation associated with opioids. It was not easy to procure them. It was not easy to prescribe them, to store them. And even the people were a little stigmatized. They felt that taking morphine means people say that you're an addict, So there was a lot of stigma attached to morphine. and opioids. So because of all this, it was not being used to the, for the purpose it was meant for, that's to treat severe pain. But when the WHO made this ladder, it was included as a third step of the ladder. So it practically legitimized the use of opioids in the treatment of severe pain. So it means when the WHO has endorsed it, then why should we hesitate in prescribing it, or why should we hesitate in taking it? So because of this, a lot of people with severe pain started taking morphine, and there was a lot of relief of pain in these people. Next, please. So to apply the ladder, you need to assess the pain. That is a very important. First and foremost, we have to do that. So first you have to differentiate between a nociceptive pain and a neuropathic pain. I think in your earlier talk, you might have known about the difference between nociceptive and neuropathic pain. Because based on that, only you can apply the ladder in its full, to its full extent. The other thing you need to know is what is the intensity of pain. So the intensity of pain, is it mild, is it moderate, is it severe? So for this, there are various tools that are there to, okay, there are various tools to assess the intensity of pain. So these are some of the unidimensional tools. I'm telling unidimensional because it is only measuring the severity of pain and it is not measuring any other aspect of pain. So we have the visual analog scale and the numerical rating score by which we know about the intensity of pain. So it's only measuring one dimension. Next, please. So this is the ladder. So you start, it's basically a three-step ladder that was, the first was made. That is what we are basically following. It's a three-step ladder. Step one is when there is mild pain. That is, you would say in a NRS score of up to 4, So in that step, if you feel that it's a step one, mild pain, then you can use a non-opioid analgesic with or without adjuvant. Adjuvant is dependent upon whether there are any other features associated with this pain. I'll talk about that later on when I'm talking about adjuvant. Now, if the pain is not controlled with this, okay, and the pain is in the rating of maybe 5 to 7, then you would call it moderate pain, in which case you may have to add to this step, you will have to add a weak opioid. So you add a weak opioid plus a non-opioid plus minus a adjuvant drug. Okay. Now, sometimes the pain is not controlled even with a weak opioid, and then you go to the next step, which is the third step of the ladder, which is you're substituting the weak opioid with a strong opioid. So you give a strong opioid with or without a non-opioid drug, with or without an adjuvant drug. But sometimes when the pain is very severe, then, straight from step one, you don't have to go to step 2. You can straight away go to step 3 if it is very severe pain. Or if you do an opioid trial and you find that the patient is having severe pain, and then you can go on to a strong opioid. Now, the good thing about this ladder is using this ladder, the stepwise ladder, up to 71 to 76% of cancer pain can be relieved. So that is a very good thing because a big chunk of people can be relieved with this kind of approach to pain. Next, please. So now let us talk about the salient features of a ladder. It is very important that we know this because only then we can apply it. So the three important, if you want to just remember 3 points, it is by mouth, by ladder, by clock. Okay. So what is by mouth? By mouth is all these drugs are given orally. Okay. That means that is a standard route of giving these drugs. So that is a big advantage. The advantage is it can be suitable for home care. It can be given by the visiting nurse, the domiciliary nurse who's visiting the patient at their homes. It can also be given by the caregiver, and it can also be taken by the patient also if the patient is in a literate and in full senses and things like that. So that is a very important feature of this thing, that it is given by mouth. You don't have to give it subcutaneous or unless, of course, there are other reasons, but basically it can be given by the mouth. The second important feature is given by the ladder. By the ladder means you go up the ladder. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Okay. And Of course, like I said, you can sometimes skip one step and go on to the next step, but basically you go by the stepwise way of handling the. The third important thing is given by the clock. By the clock means you don't wait for the pain to come back to give the drug, but rather you're giving it based on the duration of action of the drug. For example, morphine's duration of action is 4 hours. That means at 4 hours, you must give the second dose of morphine, irrespective of whether the pain has come back or not. Paracetamol is 6 hours. So at the end of 6 hours, you give the paracetamol. Don't wait for the pain to come back. Because if the pain comes back, it forms peaks and valleys rather than one continuous plateau. So the patient is very much distressed, the pain has come back. It's more difficult to control the pain that has come back with some severity. It's easier to maintain it at a plateau level. So you go by the duration of action of the drug or by the half-life of the drug rather than by the patient complaining of pain and then you're giving it. So that is important of the clock. So if you're prescribing morphine, you have to be very, very careful as to you even tell the timing you have to take the patient. Like first dose at 6, next at 10, then at 2, then at 6, then at 10. You can write it down also and say you maintain a chart and you tick mark according to the time given, the time that you've given them. Besides that, there are 3 other important aspects of the ladder. One is it is individualized to the patient. That means the right dose is that which relieves that pain, irrespective of the dose. It could be as low as 30 milligrams of morphine. It could be as high as 60 milligrams of morphine. But for some, it can produce good relief at 30. Some you may require higher doses. So the right dose is the one that is causing the pain relief. So, and also you can tell them that in between, if they have pain, that is called a breakthrough pain, then what you have to do. That also has to be specified to the patient. So basically, you're individualizing it to one particular patient to see that that patient has got the relief. The other important thing is that you're using adjuvant drugs at every step of the ladder. Step 1, step 2, step 3, you're using adjuvant drugs. First of all, it is to counter specific types of pain. And secondly, it is also to reduce the undesirable side effects of some of the analgesics. And the last important thing is attention to detail. Now, that means you have to take into account the age of the patient, the body weight of the patient, the presence of comorbidities, what are the drugs that the patient is on, and also all the side effects of the medication should be meticulously monitored. So you have to pay attention to detail to every single aspect of the patient. Next, please. So what are the advantages of the WHO ladder? Like I said, it is simple, easily understandable. It is a validated tool. It is also very cost effective because most of the drugs that we are giving are relatively inexpensive drugs. They're not very expensive drugs. So it can be implemented across the world, even in the underdeveloped countries. It is well suited for home care and it can be applied not only for cancer pain, but for acute pain like you see after a fracture or after post-operative pain, or it can be even given for chronic non-cancer pain as well. But of course, there are some caveats for that because in chronic non-cancer pain, you have to be very careful when you're using strong opioids because of the risk of substance abuse. So that's a different thing altogether, but otherwise it can be applicable for all these categories also. Next, please. Like I said, sometimes you can omit the second step, but most often, sometimes we may even have to have a fourth step to the ladder. And that is for treating intractable pain not responding to the WHO's step 3 drugs. Okay, so next, please. So in 2020, this modified analgesic ladder was made and it was treating those 10 to 15% of patients that were not responding to the WHO ladder, including the strong opioids. So what is this fourth step? That includes, you may have to give a nerve block. Many of you all are anesthetists, so you must be knowing the kind of things that we are doing for treating pain. So you can give a nerve block, You can give epidural injections. You can use a patient-controlled analgesia pump, or you can give a neurolytic block, like for pancreatic cancer, you can give a celiac plexus block, or you can use various intrathecal devices as well as advanced therapies like dorsal cord stimulation or intrathecal morphine pump. So these are all the advanced interventions that you can use in patients who are not responding to the step 3 of the ladder. Next, please. So now let us discuss step 1. Next. Like I said, it is used to treat mild to moderate pain. And the step 1 drugs are paracetamol, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and they can be combined with an adjuvant drug. Next, please. So let's discuss paracetamol because it's a very important drug that is used in the WHO step ladder. It is also called acetaminophen in the US, and it is basically having a central action. It inhibits the enzyme cyclooxygenase called COX in the central nervous system. Now, it has no effect on the peripheral cyclooxygenase enzyme, and so its undesirable effects that you're getting with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs is not there with paracetamol. Its basic action is as an antipyretic and analgesic, but with no anti-inflammatory properties, unlike the NSAIDs. Next, please. So what are the dose recommendations? Most of you all are doctors. I think everyone are doctors. So I think you all must be well aware of the doses that we're using in paracetamol. Suffice to say that a single dose should not exceed 1 gram, and in a day you should not exceed 4 grams. Okay, that is the basic thing that you should remember. And normally you give it at 650 mg every 6 hours. But it has a potential for hepatotoxicity, but still it is still safe to give in liver disease in doses of 2 to 3 grams a day. It can be used very widely in pediatric practice, up to 15 mg per kg 6 hourly. Toxicity only happens when you exceed 90 milligram per kg per day. The NNT of paracetamol is 5. Now, NNT is a measure to assess the efficacy of a drug. It is the numbers needed to treat. That means, by when you mean 5, it means that for every 5 patients you give paracetamol, 1 patient is getting up to 50% pain relief. So that is what it means by NNT. So the lower the NNT, the more effective the drug. The higher the NNT, the less effective. Now, paracetamol can be given also in the rectal route also. So in some patients, when oral route is not feasible, like patients with oral cancers or CA tongue or whose mouth opening is impaired, then you can give it rectally also, but you would always prefer the oral route as far as possible. Next, please. Now, why has paracetamol become such a popular analgesic is because its safety profile is very good and the undesirable effects are less common. It has no adverse effect on the gastric mucosa, and it has no adverse renal effects. It has no adverse effects on platelet function. Even in those who have got hypersensitivity reactions to aspirin, like allergic manifestations, you can use paracetamol. Also, it doesn't affect the plasma uric acid. So it can be given a patient's bout as well. Next, please. But the drawbacks are that it has to be given every 6 hours and it has a potential for hepatotoxicity. So what you should remember is do not exceed a dose of 4 grams. And if the body weight is less than 50, then you restrict to only 2 grams a day. And if there is alcohol consumption of excess of 3 drinks a day, you have to be very careful when you give that. Next, please. So in cancer pain, it is very effective because of its safety profile. It has an opioid sparing effect because if you add paracetamol to the opioid, it actually can decrease the amount of opioid you're giving. And also, it is given at every step of the ladder. It can be given in step 1 with NSAIDs, it can be given step 2 with tramadol, it can be given with step 3 with opioids. So it can be added to everything. And by adding a paracetamol to these drugs, you reduce the NNT also. Next, please. So now we come to the next step 1 drug, which is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or called NSAIDs. Now, these act by inhibiting the peripheral cyclooxygenase enzyme. Now, peripheral cyclooxygenase, like I will show you in my next slide, is a very important enzyme in the tissue breakdown process. Like when there's a tissue breakdown, like an injury, tissue injury, then the cell membrane, there is a release of lipids, phospholipids, which enters the arachidonic acid cascade and ultimately converted into prostaglandins, which is actually producing the pain because of its inflammatory properties, right? And it also causes peripheral sensitization. That means when there is a lot of prostaglandins at the nerve ending, the amplitude and the sensitivity of the nerve impulses increase and patient feels more pain. That's called peripheral sensitization. So in this kind of pain, this NSAIDs is very effective because it has got anti-inflammatory properties. Next, please. So in this, you see that when there is a tissue injury, there is release of phospholipids, which is converted to arachidonic acid, which is ultimately converted into prostaglandins by this enzyme COX-2, that is cyclooxygenase 2. So this happens only when there is a tissue injury. But there's another COX, which is called COX-1, that is normally present in the body. And that is called the constitutive or the housekeeping enzyme, and that is responsible for the maintaining the homeostatic functions of the stomach, the kidney, the platelet function, etc. So it is essential for that enzyme to be present to maintain all this. But when you give a anti-inflammatory drug that is inhibiting the cyclooxygenase, many of these are inhibiting even the COX-1 enzyme also. So you have the adverse effects that are present because you're inhibiting this enzyme. But because you're inhibiting this, it will produce the anti-inflammatory effects. Okay. So next, this will be more clear. So in this, you can see that there are two types of NSAIDs. One is the non-selective, which is interfering both with COX-1 and COX-2. By inhibiting the COX-1, you're producing the adverse effects on the stomach, kidney, or the platelets, etc. But by inhibiting the COX-2, it is producing the anti-inflammatory effect. But there's another group of drugs called the selective COX-2 inhibitor, which is inhibiting only the COX-2. It is not inhibiting COX-1. So the beneficial effects of COX-1 are preserved and only the adverse effects of COX-2 are inhibited. So now I'll talk about this later more about it. Next, please. So if you look at the non-selective NSAIDs, they are the ones that we're using very commonly, like aspirin, ibuprofen, naproxen, etc. Okay. So because it is inhibiting the COX-1 also, you have the GI side effects, you have hypersensitivity reactions, or you can have the adverse renal effects. But by inhibiting the COX-2 and inhibiting prostaglandin synthesis, it is having a beneficial effect. So it is anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and antipyretic properties. So you see this non-selective NSAIDs is a double-edged sword, which has got adverse effects as well as the beneficial effects. You have to weigh the two when you're giving these. Next, please. So non-selective NSAIDs, the commonly used ones are ibuprofen, which is given orally. Its NNT is 2. That means for every 2 people, 1 person is getting relieved of pain. So it has got a very good efficacy. The second is naproxen. That is also given only orally or by suppository. And that is also having an NNT of 2.7. So the NNTs of these are better than paracetamol, which I told you is 5. Right? Next, please. Now, if you look at the COX-1 inhibition, because it is inhibiting the COX-1, which is a housekeeping enzyme, you have the adverse cardiovascular effects, you have the adverse renal effects, and the gastrointestinal effects, hypersensitivity reactions. So you can have angioedema, skin allergies, and then you can have renal dysfunction, and also you can also have some cardiovascular dysfunction as well. Next, please. So what are the risk factors that you should avoid in the patients when you want to give a COX-1, the non-selective NSAIDs? You know, if the patient is old, or it has to be given for a long duration, or if there's a history of upper GI bleed, or if the patient is using anticoagulants, steroids, etc., then you avoid it. Then for renal toxicity, dehydration is very important. The patient has to be well hydrated when you're giving these drugs, because then they can cause adverse renal effects. And also if the creatinine clearance is less than 30 ml per minute. And of course, for the stroke and MI, it is mainly seen with the COX-2 drugs. So if the patients are having advanced age, history of diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, smoking, be very careful when you're using the COX-2 drugs that I'll talk about later. Next, please. Now coming to the selective COX-2 inhibitor. That means it is not inhibiting COX-1. So its beneficial effects are maintained, but it is inhibiting only COX-2 so that it is anti-inflammatory. So the examples are etoricoxib, celecoxib, and diclofenac sodium. Okay. Now etoricoxib is given as a once a day dose only. And diclofenac, of course, you can give orally and IV in a dose of 50 mg 8-hourly. The NNT of diclofenac is very good. It is 2. Okay. Next, please. Now, NSAIDs can also be given topically. It can produce the analgesic effect, at the same time, less risk of systemic absorption and toxicity. For example, you have a lot of creams and gels with ibuprofen, diclofenac, piroxicam, and ketoprofen. So they can be applied also with some effect. Next, please. Now coming to the selective COX-2 inhibitors. So we have already told you what are selective COX-2 inhibitors. So are they really safe? Can it really be given on all those people who have peptic ulcers and who have got renal function or allergy and all? Now it has been found that where the GIT is concerned, it is beneficial. That means it will prevent peptic ulceration formation and all these bleeding problems in the stomach. But where the renal damage is concerned, it is not really beneficial and it can be as bad as a non-selective NSAID. But on the other hand, it has got prothrombotic effects. And there is a more likelihood of MI and stroke occurring in these patients, particularly those who have the risk factors like atherosclerotic heart disease. So one of the drugs like rofecoxib in 2004 was taken off the market because of this side effect that it caused. So in such patients, the NSAIDs of choice is ibuprofen and naproxen. They can be given in high-risk cardiac cases as well, without a risk of MI and all the other cardiovascular side effects. So having discussed step 1 drugs, let's go on to step 2 drugs. Now the step 2 drugs are the weak opioid drugs along with NSAIDs or with or without an adjuvant. Now they are called controlled drugs. That means they are not so difficult to procure like morphine, for which you need a very strict form, the DD12 form has to be filled and everything. So in that way, it's not controlled, but at the same time, it is an opioid also. So it can have some of the good effects of opioids. So, but like I said, the commonly used step 2 drugs are tramadol and tapentadol. Next, please. Now coming to tramadol. Now tramadol, I said, is a weak opioid. Okay, so it has a dual method of action. The one method is by a opioid agonist. So it's a weak opioid. But because it's weak, it has got less tendency for respiratory depression and less addiction potential as compared to the strong opioids. But it also has another method of action, and that is it blocks the presynaptic uptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. So it is actually acting on the descending inhibitory pathway of pain. There are some pathways that are coming from the brain to the spinal cord, which are inhibiting the pain impulses from going up. And that is mediated by the release of serotonin and norepinephrine. So this action is actually preventing, allowing that inhibition to occur. So the pain is not going upwards to the brain. Now, its NNT for neuropathic pain has been found to be 3.8. And we are very commonly using a combination of tramadol and paracetamol as a step 2 drug, which is very commonly used. Next, please. Now, it has got a very high bioavailability. That's one of its plus points. The oral dose is 1/5 as potent as morphine. So if you give the doses around 50 to 100 mg every 4 to 6 hours with a maximum dose of 400 mg per day. The IV dose is 1/10 as potent as morphine. So if you look at the equianalgesic dose of tramadol and morphine, then 400 mg tramadol is equivalent to 80 mg of oral morphine and 40 mg of IV morphine. Sustained release formulations are also available, in which case you need to give it only twice a day. So it's called tramadol SR or something like that. It's available. Extended release tramadol is also. Next, please. Now, tapentadol is another weak opioid that is used as step 2 drug. It is structurally similar to tramadol. Its method of action is also similar to tramadol. It is a dual method of action, but its side effect profile is better as compared to tramadol. And the dose is also very similar, and sustained release formation is available for that also. Next, please. Now coming to neuropathic pain. We have talked about step 1 and step 2 drugs, and now let us discuss about neuropathic pain. Now, cancer pain is multifaceted pain. That means in addition to nociceptive pain, you can also have neuropathic pain. You can have pain due to muscle spasm, pain due to bone pain. You can have pain due to bowel obstruction, or there could be so many other associated symptoms as well. So the adjuvant drugs are handling all those kinds of problems, not just the nociceptive. Next, please. So analgesic drugs are called adjuvant. They are called adjuvant because the primary indication is not for pain. For example, if you take as antidepressant drugs, the primary indication is anxiety and depression, but it has also got analgesic properties. So that is why it's called a adjuvant drug, or it's called a co-analgesic. That means it's given along with the other analgesics of the WHO step 9. Next, please. So they can be broadly classified as multi-purpose and adjuvant drugs and specific types of pain. For example, neuropathic pain has got special drugs that you can give. Bone pain has got specific adjuvants. Musculoskeletal pain has specific. But there are other drugs like steroids and antidepressants and sedatives that can be given for a variety of conditions. So it's got a multi-purpose effect. It can be used for many reasons of pain. Next, please. Now let's talk about neuropathic pain because that's very important. Up to 40% of patients with cancer have neuropathic pain as well, along with nociceptive. What is neuropathic pain? The Indian Association of Study of Pain in 2018 defined it as caused by a disease or lesion in the peripheral or the central nervous system. Because of that lesion, the transmission of pain has become altered, or it has gone awry, and that is why it is sensed in a different way. How do you sense it? You can have dysesthesia, you can have allodynia, you can have burning pain, tingling, numbness, all these are the characteristics of the pain because of the lesion in the either the central nervous system or in the peripheral. And it can be because of either invasion of the nerve by the tumor or by surgery, or very commonly by chemotherapy, because chemotherapy is damaging the peripheral nerves and it is causing a chemotherapy kind of neuropathy. Next, please. So what are the drugs used for neuropathic pain? The commonly used ones are anticonvulsants, antidepressants. You can use the step 2 drugs like I mentioned earlier, tramadol and tapentadol, because of its preventing the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. And also the step 3 drugs like morphine and methadone are also used in neuropathy. And the less commonly used drugs are local anesthetics, NMDA antagonists, corticosteroids, GABA agonists. So let's discuss a little more about this. Next, please. Now, there's a neuropathic pain ladder, starting from step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Step 1 is tricyclic antidepressants or an anti-epileptic. Step 2 is TCA plus anti-epileptic. Okay, you have to add it both together. Step 3 is an NMDA antagonist like ketamine, and step 4 is a local anesthetic like lignocaine. So let's discuss step 1 drugs. Next, please. Now, it's a first line of treatment for neuropathic pain. So let's discuss the anticonvulsants. Okay, we said both anticonvulsants and antidepressants are first line drugs. So we are discussing about anticonvulsants. Now, why are anticonvulsants used for neuropathic pain? How is it? Do they have a shared pathophysiology between convulsions and pain? Yes, because in both there is neuronal hyperexcitability, and these drugs are actually dampening the neuronal excitement. That is how they are acting. And the commonly used anticonvulsants are gabapentin, pregabalin, and sodium valproate. Next, please. So if you look at this, how do the gabapentinoids act in neuropathic pain? If you look at it, this is the voltage, the calcium channel through which calcium is entering into the presynaptic membrane. And this is blocked by these drugs so that calcium is not entering, and this influx of calcium is prevented, and the release of these excitatory neurotransmitters like aspartate, glutamate, etc. are prevented. So there is less postsynaptic excitation. So that is how these drugs are acting, by blocking these voltage-gated calcium channels. Next, please. So gabapentin and pregabalin, so they are very good in the sense that very well tolerated, can be given for longer duration of time, but it has got some side effects which you should explain to the patient. They can have increased somnolence, drowsiness, dizziness, ataxia, fatigue, weight gain, edema, etc. So these have to be told to the patient. Next, please. And gabapentin's oral bioavailability is unpredictable as compared to pregabalin. So you have to start with a small dose and titrate it upwards. But the big advantage is it's less expensive as compared to pregabalin. Pregabalin is more expensive, but you can titrate it in 1 or 2 or 3 steps. Okay, and it is also found to be quite effective. Next, please. Now, the next step 1 drug for neuropathic pain is the antidepressant drugs. Now, its onset takes up to 1 week. You know, you can't expect the patient to improve immediately, but you can tell them that you take 1 or 2 weeks for its effect to come off. Now, although it is an antidepressant, its analgesic effects are happening at much lower doses and earlier as compared to its antidepressant. For antidepression, you have to give much higher doses, not the doses that we are using in pain management. But because it is an antidepressant, and many of these patients have got insomnia, depression, anxiety, you find that this is a very good drug to treat pain as well as all these problems. So I find it a very useful drug. So how does it act? It acts by the same mechanism I told you. It is preventing the reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin at the dorsal spinal synapses. And because of that, these levels are increased, and it is activating the descending inhibition of pain. Okay. Next, please. So the 3 types of antidepressants are available. One is a tricyclic antidepressant, which commonly used are amitriptyline or tryptamor and nortriptyline. The serotonin SNRI is a serotonin norepinephrine receptor inhibitor. That commonly used drug is duloxetine or milnacipran or venlafaxine, etc. But you also have SSRI, which is selective serotonin inhibitor. So this is used mainly when there's anxiety and depression along with the pain. Okay, and the example that we're using is escitalopram. Next, please. But TCA has got the side effects. The central nervous system side effects are somnolence, drowsiness, mental clouding, even suicidal tendencies. And next, but because of its anticholinergic effect, next please, it has got dry mouth, It can precipitate acute angle glaucoma. It can cause cardiotoxicity like tachycardia, urinary retention, constipation, and orthostatic hypotension. So all this has to be clearly mentioned. If the patient has any of these underlying problems like prostate enlargement or glaucoma or cardiac disease, then we should avoid PCA in these patients. Next, please. So what are the dose of these drugs? Like we start with amitriptyline in a dose of 10 mg, then you can keep going up to 25 mg, up to even 100 mg. Nortriptyline again in dose of 10 to 25 mg. Gabapentin, you can start with 100 mg and go up to even 1200 mg per day. Pregabalin start with about 75 mg and you can go upwards gradually, increasing it twice. Sodium, but just remember, all these drugs and dosage should be adjusted to the medical condition of the patient, the age, the comorbidities, the presence of renal dysfunction, etc. So you have to start accordingly with a lower dose. Next, please. What are the other drugs used in neuropathic pain? We talked about the step 3, which is an NMDA blocker or the ketamine. Now, ketamine we know is a NMDA blocker, and it acts at the dorsal root ganglion by inhibiting the NMDA inhibitor. So that is how it is acting. So if you use this, it is found to be very effective for neuropathic pain that is not responding to antidepressants and anticonvulsants. Now, ketamine is normally an anesthetic drug, but when we use it for pain management, you use it at sub-anesthetic doses, very low doses, as compared to what you use for anesthesia. But it has got its side effects. It's got dysphoria, hallucinations, delirium, vomiting, and dizziness. To prevent that, you can add a drug like haloperidol or a benzodiazepine so that you can prevent these psychotomimetic side effects. Next. So I told you it's given in sub-anesthetic doses, so about 10 to 25 mg orally TDS, or if you're giving us an infusion, about 50 to 100 mg per day. Okay. Now there's another thing which you're using for those patients who are not responding to other treatments like morphine and things like that. When you want to use a burst dose, it's called a pulse dose of ketamine. For that, you have to give it for 5 days as an infusion. You start off with 100 mg per day using a syringe pump. And at the end of 3 days, if the patient is not responding, then you step it up to 300 mg per day. And at the end of 3 days, not responding, you go up to 500 mg per day and then stop. So with this, you can sometimes control the vicious circle of neuropathic pain or pain that is not responding to the other drugs. But all this has to be done in a hospital setup with adequate monitoring facility and the availability of a syringe pump. Next, please. Now, the fourth drug of the neuropathic pain is a local anesthetic. Now, local anesthetics acts by inhibiting the neuronal excitability at the level of the sodium channels. I think that you are all aware of. So, we use IV xylocaine in a dose of 5 milligram per kg over a period of 1 hour as an infusion, and along with the cardiac monitoring and observing the patient very carefully. And sometimes you can stop the vicious circle of pain by doing this. But even topical local anesthetics are available. 5% lidocaine patches are available in India now. It's called Lidobelaris, I think it's the brand name. So these patches can be applied over the area of the neuropathic pain. For example, if a patient has a post-herpetic neuralgia, then you can apply the patch over it, and it should be remaining 12 hours on, but for the 12 hours, you must take it off. It should not be there for continuously 24 hours. So you can even apply up to 3 patches a day. Now, steroids. Like I said, it is a multi-purpose analgesic adjuvant drug. It can be given for a wide variety of reasons. So these are all the reasons you can give it for neuropathic pain, for bone pain, for headache due to bone metastasis, because it reduces the peritumoral edema. It's useful for arthralgia, pain due to obstruction of a hollow viscus, or pain due to spinal metastasis. The drug of choice is dexamethasone, although you can give methylprednisolone and other drugs. But the advantage of dexamethasone is it's got a very long half-life. Its half-life is 36 to 54 hours. So you have to give it only once a day. And another advantage is it's got less mineralocorticoid properties. So it doesn't cause so much of water retention and so on. But remember, steroids can cause insomnia. So you should not give it in the night. Give it in the morning or early evening if you're giving it twice daily. Next, please. The other drug that is used is GABA agonist. It is used when there is neuropathic pain due to spasticity. So the one that is commonly used is baclofen or lioresal in a dose of 10 mg, which you can gradually step up. And you have to be very careful when reducing it because you can get seizures. Next, please. Bone pain. This is another very common pain that you get, particularly in those with bone metastasis. It's called skeletal related events. And that pain can be very agonizing. It can affect the quality of life of the individual and it can really make them very miserable. So how do you treat bone pain? Next, please. You can start off with corticosteroids and normal non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs for multifocal bone pain. But also you can use like calcitonin or Gemcal because it's got the osteoblastic effect. It can be given subcutaneously or intranasally in a dose of 200 units per day for 14 days. It can cause osteoblastic effect. The other drug that is used is bisphosphonates. The one that is commonly used is zoledronic acid. It's given in a dose of 4 mg every 4 to 8 weeks intravenously. It causes stimulates osteoblastic effect and inhibits osteoclastic effect. And that is how it is preventing the bone pain. But it has got some side effects. It can cause renal dysfunction. It can even cause what is called osteonecrosis of the jaw, which is a very serious side effect. That has to be kept in mind. Then denosumab is another drug that is used for bone metastasis. It is also got inhibits osteoclastic activity and stimulates osteoblastic effect. It is basically a human monoclonal antibody, and it is more expensive than bisphosphonates. But it is not to be given for metastasis from prostate gland, but it can be used for other metastases, but not for prostate. The other thing that you can use for bone pain is palliative radiation using strontium and samarium. So you can give the targeted radiation to the bone mets when the lesions are localized. For example, like a spinal metastasis and all, you can use targeted radiation. Next, please. Now, pain due to bowel obstruction. That is also one of the problems of certain types of intra-abdominal tumors. So you can use steroids to decrease the edema in the bowel. You can add a somatostatin and an analog like octreotide or an anticholinergic drug like hyoscine, butyl bromide, or glycopyrrolate. They act by decreasing the intraluminal secretions and peristaltic movements. So when you combine all these, it can be quite useful in reducing the symptoms of bowel. Next, please. So some of the other adjuvant drugs are the muscle relaxants, like I mentioned here, particularly when there's a lot of muscle spasm, or if the patient has got delirium and agitation, you can use neurolepts like olanzapine. Sometimes you may have to use sedatives to ensure that they're getting a good sleep, because if you don't get good sleep, your pain threshold decreases and you feel more pain the next day. So you should ensure that the patient gets a very good sleep. You may have to use an anxiolytic like lorazepam or clonazepam. You can use anxiolytics also, or sometimes you may have to use laxatives also. So there are a whole lot of other adjuvant drugs also that you can use in patients with all these other kinds of pain. Last piece, last slide. To summarize, the WHO analgesic ladder is the sheet anchor for cancer pain management. It can be also used for non-cancer pain also. The advantages are its simplicity, easy implementation, availability for home care, and even it can be done in any part of the world, it can be implemented. And very important, it has legitimized the use of opioids in cancer pain and in non-cancer pain as well. So that's about my talk today. And if there are any questions, you're most welcome.
Thank you, madam. Talk. Anybody want to ask any questions or comments?
Hello.
Yeah.
Good evening,
Please
ma'am.
ask.
I just want to ask, can we use this ketamine burst therapy and the local anesthetic infusion in post-op pain also?
Post-op pain is not this we are talking of neuropathic pain. Just remember, post-op pain is a nociceptive pain. It is because of tissue injury, not because of nerve injury. Okay. So there are a lot of drugs that can be used for that kind of pain. So why do we have to use ketamine for that? Because ketamine is acting for neuropathic pain and not for nociceptive. So when there's a nerve injury, that is when you're giving this infusion, not for the post-op pain, which is due to a tissue injury. I don't think it is. And you have got so many very good drugs that you can use for nociceptive pain. There is no need to do it. Any other questions?
Ma'am, I require regarding tramadol, it has emetic properties. It tends to cause nausea and vomiting in patients. Is there a better option for weak opioids besides tramadol?
One of the side effects of tramadol, yeah. But normally, sometimes we're giving IV tramadol, we always give an antiemetic also along with it. Okay? But
Yes.
not all patients get nausea, vomiting. So if you start off with a low dose of tramadol and the patient is tolerating well, you can go ahead because it is definitely a very useful drug. But certain people do not tolerate it, in which case you have to look at other options. But I would say in my practice, around hardly 10 to 15 patients are actually complaining of nausea, vomiting. Many people are, tolerating it very well. But of course, if they are having nausea, vomiting, it is definitely because of tramadol. So you can try other alternatives. Maybe tapentadol would be good because it's got less side effects. That's also
Tapentadol is it more expensive than
Yeah.
tramadol? It's more expensive.
It's expensive, right? Tapentadol. Actually, even gabapentin and pregabalin, so many patients have, though they have a very good pain relief, so many patients have nausea and vomiting. So, do you combine antiemetic for them also?
I have not encountered
So,
gabapentin.
that is probably because you're using it for cancer pain, because we use it for, I'm basically working with a rheumatologist. So when we use that, I have a lot of patients who have vomit, nausea, especially pregabalin.
Pregabalin in my chronic pain management.
Uh,
Nausea.
it won't happen. Okay, thank you.
Has got other effects, but not nausea vomiting. Because my 75% of my patients are chronic pain patients.
Because I've noticed that a lot of other doctors, when they use it for other symptoms they don't have, but when we use it for short time and all, they come back to us with vomiting and they're not even able to tolerate one tablet. So I was wondering how they are tolerating and these people are not tolerating.
But I have not encountered that side effect.
Yeah, even myself with gabapentin and pregabalin, it's mostly dizziness, ma'am. It's not nausea or anything.
This is the main thing. Dizziness and sleepiness, they complain
Dizziness, yeah, right. Ma'am, actually on one request, I just missed the first 10 minutes. Just that who analgesic ladder, is it okay if you can explain me in little short? I joined late, I was stuck in OPD actually. Not the full one, just the picture you can show and just one in short in 5, if it's possible.
Yeah.
The
Rajalakshmi,
first slide alone. I'm so sorry for troubling, but
no problem. Rajalakshmi, you can just.
1 second, ma'am. We will put the presentation in. Ma'am, which slide? Actually, the ladder one.
Next one, next one. Yeah, next one. Next. Okay, this is a ladder. This you know, na? I'm sure. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Okay. You want me to explain this?
no, only the step, ma'am. That's all.
Go
Only the
back.
steps, ma'am. That's all.
The same slide. Can you show Rajesh? Yeah. So basically, this is based on the intensity of pain. So you must first assess the pain to know whether it is a nociceptive pain, neuropathic pain, and what is the intensity of pain based on your scales, NRS scale or a visual analog scale. And then depending on that, you go onto the ladder. If the pain is mild pain, which is intensity is around maybe less than 4, then you can start with non-opioid drugs and with or without an adjuvant drugs. And the non-opioid drugs that we are using are paracetamol with or without NSAIDs. Okay. If it's not responding to that, then you go to step 2, which is a weak opioid along with these non-opioid drugs and adjuvant. And but we can sometimes even skip this step and go on to step 3, which is for severe pain, which is a strong opioid with or without a non-opioid drug and with or without an adjuvant drug. So these are the 3 steps of the ladder. And with this, you can treat up to 76% of pain. Cancer patients can be relieved with this, just using this step drug. And next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just showing that the main features are that it's given by mouth, by ladder, and by clock. So because it is by mouth, it can be very useful for home care, for caregivers can give it, even the patient himself or herself can take the medicine. Okay, they are taught how to give it. And then the other advantage is it's by the ladder. That means you always try to go up from step 1 to step 3. Okay, so it's a stepwise increase in the drugs. And by the clock is based on the duration of action of the drug, not upon when the patient is having pain and then you give it. So if the duration of action is 4 hours, you give it every 4 hours. So that has been clearly told to the patient. So by giving it according to the clock, then you're preventing any of the breakthrough pains or any of the peaks that are happening in between, and the patient is much more comfortable. And then, of course, it is individualized to the patient, depending upon, like, for example, a patient can have relief with 30 milligram morphine, a patient can have relief with 60 milligram morphine. It's all individually based. The pain that is the dose that is causing complete relief is the correct dose for that particular patient. It can be low, it can be high. That's immaterial, but the patient should have pain relief. Okay, that way you can prevent. And also, if there's a breakthrough pain, even before the action, before the next dose, you have to tell the patient that if there's a breakthrough pain, what you should do. So all these are individualized to the patient. And another important thing is adjuvant drugs are added at every step of the ladder. With or without, I mean, it may or may not be added. And that is not only to increase the efficacy of the drug, like when you add a neuropathic drug, it will help in decreasing the overall pain, but also because it will even prevent the side effects of some of the medicines. And attention to detail means the patient's body weight, age, comorbidities, drug allergies, everything have to be kept in mind when you're tailoring the drug regime for the patient. So an 87-year-old lady will require only so much. You have to, whereas a 50-year-old man or a 30-year-old man will require more. So it all depends upon the age and the presence of comorbidity. So you have to pay attention to every detail, including the side effects, because many of these drugs can have side effects. So that has to be explained in detail and monitored also. So these are the things.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Ma'am, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
How do you manage the pain related to raised intracranial tension?
Okay. Now, that's a good question you asked, because if there is a raised intracranial tension, then, we don't know, there is an intracranial pressure volume curve. Okay. So you don't know at which point of the curve the patient is. It could be that even a slight raise in intracranial pressure can make the patient cone. Okay. So we don't know where it is. Now. The tumor is there. We don't know whether the compliance is completely gone or still is there a lot of compliance left. It's called the intracranial compliance curve. So you have to be very careful when you give drug. Like, for example, in patients with brain tumors, I would avoid giving a drug like which causes respiratory depression, like morphine. Because when you give morphine and there is some amount of respiratory depression, the CO2 can build up and CO2 can raise the intracranial volume and it can suddenly cause the patient to cone. So we normally in our neuroanesthesia practice, we never used to give morphine in the preoperative period, but intraop we can give it, that sort of problem. So keeping that in mind, the intracranial pressure is usually elevated because of the edema around the tumor. Okay, there's a lot of edema which you can see on the CT scan, that there's a peritumoral edema. So dexamethasone is a very useful drug to give in these patients because it decreases the peritumoral edema. But at the same time, you want to add another analgesic. I would prefer to avoid any drug that causes respiratory depression because you don't know where the patient is and the patient can suddenly cone. So you should avoid those drugs, and things like tramadol, paracetamol, or any of these, they can be given. Tramadol and paracetamol are very effective, and along with, of course, steroids. But again, like once we had the same question raised last time, Sunil had mentioned, if the patient is in end stage and the patient is having a lot of pain and very severe pain, you may have to give morphine also in such patients, because then at that point of time, your only aim is to relieve the patient of pain and not anything else. But in an elective basis, I would prefer to avoid drugs that cause respiratory depression because of the CO2 rising, and that can further elevate the IC.
How about
Dr.
mannitol?
Rajesh?
Madam, how about mannitol?
Mannitol has to be given. Mannitol also decreases the brain edema, no? So mannitol is given, but it's not for pain specifically.
Yeah.
Decrease the intracranial pressure.
Does oral glycerin has an effect? Any effect?
Oral glycerin, yes. Oral glycerin. It has also gotten a diuretic because it is hyperosmolar. It comes under hyperosmolar solutions.
Thank you.
Ma'am, one doubt. Whether the tramadol will reduce the seizure threshold level if we increase the dose during raised ICT?
Pardon me?
Whether tramadol will reduce the seizure threshold?
Oh, it can reduce the seizure threshold. Correct. You're right.
Okay. So how much we can increase the dose if the patient is having severe pain? Any hello? Ma'am, I think it's muted. I can't hear you.
No, I'm not muted.
Uh,
The
uh,
50
uh,
milligrams, you can give it every 6 to 8 hours.
okay, okay. No problem. Okay.
Ma'am, what would you give for the neuropathy caused by chemotherapy?
Okay. So this is chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain, right? So for these kind of pains, you have to use anti-neuropathic drugs like gabapentin, or you can use duloxetine has been found to be useful, or even tryptamide, amitriptyline, antidepressants also can be used. I have used very commonly, in my practical thing, I have used a combination of gabapentin with, that is a combination of gabapentin with an antidepressant. So, and gabapentin NT I've been using, nortriptyline with gabapentin, and that has been found to be quite useful. Although the literature says that duloxetine is supposed to be effective, but I have hardly used it in that practice. I mainly use gabapentin with the antidepressant.
Thank you, ma'am.
And this is off the subject. I wanted to know about your book, one that you've already written. Is it a medical book or is it a collection of your experiences? And a preview of your upcoming book, if you can share with us.
The book I had written was basically targeting the non-medical reader, but I find that many of doctors will find it very useful, because I've, although I've tried to explain it even to a lay person, but I think it will be, I'm not telling it because it's my book, but I'm telling that it will, many of my doctor friends have also found it useful.
Is it available in Amazon?
It's my co-author is a clinical psychologist.
Oh.
And with her only, I'm writing my second book. So we are writing all about pain and the mind and everything, you know, the psychology of pain and how do you treat it in a holistic way. So it's available. I will give you it's called Conquering Pain, and it is available all over in Amazon and everything. I will tell you the details. I think Rajalakshmi can put it up. It's Conquering Pain by Mary Abraham and Vandana Prakash. And the next book is Mind Over Matter, in which we are addressing only chronic pain. So that no previews are available. We're still in the process of writing it.
I'll grab my copy soon. Thank you.
And in that I've written so many case studies. So even chemotherapy-induced pain, a real person whom I treated, I've included in that book. So we have both used from our collection of our experience with patients, they've included in the book. So we've covered all kinds of pain, nociceptive pain, neuropathic pain, cancer pain, everything we have covered.
That must be interesting, ma'am. We'll wait for that one too.
So that is in this previous book, Conquering Pain. The one that has already been written, that I will.
So I think here we talked about paracetamol, NSAIDs, and weak opioids, and drugs for treating neuropathic pain. So these are drugs which we commonly use, but the problem with many of the treating physician is that the medications will not be at the optimum dose. So if suppose somebody treat neuropathic pain, they will put patient on certain, maybe a gabapentin 100 milligram TID, and they will not use it. But the proposed dose to treat neuropathic pain is up to 3,600 milligram per day. And pregabalin, amitriptyline up to 75 to 100 milligram, or tricyclics is up to 75 to 100 milligram. So those are important points that we have to note, and the side effect of NSAIDs is something which we have to be aware, because if you give a prescription to a patient for diclofenac, the patient will continue to take it. His or her family members will take that for any pain, and even neighbors will continue to take it. So that's how people use the analysis. So we have to be careful. So thank you, madam. Move on to patient story.
Yes, sir.
So Dr. Sandhi KS, who is the additional professor in Government Medical College, Kottayam, will be presenting the patient story.
Hello.
Yes,
Hello.
doctor. We can hear you, doctor.
Yes.
Okay. No, this was quickly prepared. So kindly let me apologize for the drawbacks. It won't be very good presentation like. Okay. So my patient is a 50-year-old lady, and she has a the diagnosis is cervical disc prolapse. Actually, it is a protruded disc rather than at C5-6 level rather than prolapse. Okay. So her presenting complaint is pain right shoulder and upper limb for the past 7 months. So this lady, she was having vague pain of the right shoulder and upper limb for the past 9 months. That is before 8 months. Also, she was having on and off symptoms of upper limb pain and the shoulder pain, which she was ignoring like. And she's a health worker and used to drive around 200 kilometers 5 days a week. So that much strain she used to have. Then 8 months back, one day after her hectic work in the hospital, she drove back home and developed severe pain of the right hand and shoulders. And from that day onwards, she is suffering from pain and she is not able to work like. And initially she was treated with some analgesic drugs, and then she had gone for Ayurvedic treatment, that is application of some Thailam and that sort of massaging, that sort of treatment, and took rest for a few months. But now she is having she is finding it difficult to come for work, and the performance of work is difficult for her. That is, to hold the instruments and do some fine work is difficult because the hands are affected. And she says the sleep also is affected due to pain, and for the past 10 years she is having hypothyroidism and is on Eltroxin 50 milligram per day, 50 microgram per day. On examination, her general condition, she looks healthy. Weight is around 60 and height 154 centimeters. And the positive findings on examination are the mild wasting of the right shoulder and wasting of the thenar and hypothenar muscles of the right upper limb. Then regarding the treatment and the investigations, the treatment we will come to later. Then X-ray neck and MRI neck was taken, and it showed mild disc protrusion at a C5-6 level. Not much prolapse was there. It was a mistake only. So coming to the psychosocial aspects, she is residing very far from the workplace, and her elderly mother, that is 82-year-old mother, and a girl child is with her, and husband is an NRI. So the whole family matters she was managing, and now at present she is upset because she is unable to go for work, and the work which she is having a good passion for it. So little bit upset about it. Then the medications are, she was taking paracetamol, pregabalin, and tramadol on an tramadol SOS basis. The main concerns are the because of the inability to attend or to do the work. Then she is anxious about the worsening of the pain, or whether she will have furthermore aggravation of the pain and further limitation of the activities. The summary is 50-year-old lady with hypothyroidism and the health worker by profession with a history of pain, right shoulder and upper limb since 8 months. And on examination, mild wasting of shoulder and hand muscles are there. And on investigation basis, it was diagnosed to have, she was diagnosed to have cervical disc disease. So coming to the discussion points, the from this history and examination, the assessment of pain and the management of pain, so many drawbacks are there. So how to approach it in a better way. Thank you.
Anybody needs any clarification regarding the patient story?
Pardon, sir? I can't hear you. Like,
No, I was asking, anybody need any clarification on the patient story?
Is the MRI not available? I need to see that MRI.
pardon, madam? No, no, ma'am.
Because if that, see, if it's just a mild disc bulge, it's not significant to cause a nerve root impingement. See,
Yeah,
unless the nerve roots are impinged, then this kind of pain and the wasting and all will not be there.
Okay. Actually, she had consultation with the neurosurgeons and all. So surgery was not advised. Only supportive treatment was advised.
So I mean, whether the MRI, whether the cervical disc is causing the problem or is there any other problem? Because that is what we have to find out. You know?
Wasting of thenar and hypothenar muscles it does not occur to so much with just mild disc protrusion.
Yes,
so
yes.
are we missing out some other diagnosis?
Okay.
Yeah, because see, hypothenar and all, it is other see, if it is only C5-6, no, then it will not affect the hypothenar area.
Okay.
It will be basically for the flexors of the arm, elbow, extensors of the wrist, extensor of the elbow, and of course the thumb and maximum index finger. But when you're saying hypothenar, it will not, doesn't correlate with the MRI, you know. So are we missing out, like I said, is there any other problem? You know, that's what we have to find out, you know. Is there, I mean, are there any other degenerative spine changes also we want to know, other than the disc prolapse? Does she have other degenerative changes like bony changes, osteophytes and things like that? That X-ray
osteophytes were definitely there, madam. So I forgot to mention that.
Okay.
But
and she doesn't have any tingling or numbness, right? Because if there is a thing, they are very commonly complain of tingling and numbness sensation. She only has pain and wasting. There's no tingling and numbness, right?
Also has weakness, which is seen by the fact that she's not able to use the hand effectively. So again, I think we are missing the diagnosis.
Okay.
Sensory, motor evaluation, both have to be done. You know, you have to say, unless you do that, you will not make out which is the myotome that is involved in this problem, you know. Is it the C6 myotome or C7 myotome or C5? C5 is only for the shoulder.
Deltoid like.
So all that, there are a lot of things that are not very clear.
Not clear.
Yeah.
Thing is, when the muscle wasting is there a need for active intervention? Like such a thing will be there, no?
First of all, we have to establish a diagnosis, and then only we can go for the intervention. Okay. Because otherwise we'll be barking up the wrong tree.
Okay.
But till then, I think she will benefit a lot with, I think she must have done physiotherapy, a lot of exercises, mobilization exercises, and, you know, like ma'am said, unless we find out the diagnosis, we cannot go more.
So anything to modify the management of pain, like?
See, one thing I would recommend her is to do cervical exercises. That's very important, you know, that she has to do her neck exercises, isometric neck exercises without moving her head. And then if physiotherapy, like they said, would be beneficial. And along with that, we can give her an anticonvulsant drug like you're giving a pregabalin. That also will be good. And main thing is to do strengthening exercises of her, mobilize her hand and do strengthening exercise. But she doesn't have features of tingling and numbness, so it's not very significant that there's a nerve root impingement.
And would a cervical collar, soft cervical collar be helpful?
Yes, it can help.
Collar she is not
But,
wearing.
but that is only when you're documenting a disc prolapse and all.
Okay.
If there's a disc prolapse.
So I see there are some comments in the chat. Dr. Sushil Kumar says we have to do nerve conduction study to look for the progression of the neuropathy. And differential diagnosis, he says, include myofascial pain syndrome or trigger points, brachial plexopathy, and motor neuron disease, and the thoracic outlet syndrome with cervical rib.
Yes, yes, these are all possibilities.
And Dr. Angela says C5, C6 innervation to deltoid muscle, and have you elicited Tinel sign. Dr. Vasu says mild cervical protrusion might not cause such a severe outcome.
Okay. Okay.
So, madam, suppose we take time, this patient need time to investigate, I think, we don't know. But suppose if this patient is not in a condition to investigate further, how will you reduce her pain?
Start with exercises, physiotherapy exercises, and also medications like anticonvulsant medications like either gabapentin or pregabalin, and then one analgesic with either tramadol or something like that, depending on how much. We didn't mention the severity of pain, right?
Yeah. Yes, madam.
Of pain.
That is the drawback of my presentation. I can
tell me what the severity.
Actually, she got the news to present the case history.
This was not a planned one.
So that was.
So if the pain is very severe, then we can go on to tramadol. Otherwise, we can stick to paracetamol.
Without mentioning a scorings, it's not correct way of presenting it. So.
Also, what is the type of pain? That's also very important. Is the pain burning in nature? Is it a current-like pain or is it a pulling pain? So they give also whether there's a neuropathic element in it. So that also has to be taken into account. See, the main thing I said now, when you're assessing pain, you have to do for two things. You have to differentiate between nociceptive neuropathic pain, and you have to also know about the intensity of pain. Okay. So, so if there are features of neuropathic pain, definitely this anticonvulsants and antidepressants will come in useful. And otherwise, you have to give the other medications. That's also very important.
We can't use NSAIDs now for this patient. NSAIDs.
You can.
Like first
but
tramadol.
For short term, no, not for long term. Up to 2 weeks you can use, but not longer than that. So, but the wasting is the one that is bothering me, na, that she's having wasting.
Wasting of hypotenuse.
Nothing else, you know, like they said, the thoracic outlet syndrome. If it was only for the thenar, you would think of carpal tunnel syndrome, but the hypothenar is also involved. So that means there is an ulnar nerve involvement also. So is there anything else that we need to think about? Because in carpal tunnel, only median nerve is involved, no? But here, even hypothenar basically. So whether we are missing out anything, I think she may have to have a detailed neurological examination. Maybe an NCV would be useful, like he said, nerve conduction levels.
So Dr. Vasu is asking about the type of adjuvants that can be used in this patient, which I think Madam has already talked about, like anticonvulsants or even tricyclic antidepressants.
Yeah.
I would like to share my experience regarding the cervical neuropathy. So about 1 year back, I had severe pain in the right interscapular area. Not severe pain, it was very mild to start with. But with the tablet of ibuprofen, it will go away, and I thought, okay, I'm fine, no problem. So, but within 2 days, the muscles in that region become very rigid, and I applied some ultrasound in that area. And with the Brufen, it all settled. But the next day, when I drove my car, I had to take worse, and I actually turned my neck. And after some time, I had severe pain on the right arm. It was like a corrupt. So I met a neurosurgeon and took MRI. It was C7 radiculopathy. There was an osteophyte also. So I thought I will go with the conservative management. So I told him, no need of surgery. I will take medicines. But I was taking the anticonvulsants, NSAIDs, and tramadol during that time. But during that night, my pain became severe. Actually, it was more than 10 by 10. So I took injection tramadol, no relief. So actually, I had some morphine tablet with me. Actually, I took it to the hospital with me. In case if I have severe pain, I will take it. That was my thing. But I took 5 milligram of morphine, no relief. After 1 hour, I took another 5 milligram of morphine. I got complete pain relief, even if it was a neuropathic pain. But the next day, I underwent for amniotomy and osteophyte removal. So I am fine now. So just wanted to share with you, even morphine gave me absolute pain relief, even though it was a neuropathic pain. So we usually say opioids give partial pain relief in case of neuropathic pain.
So, recent studies have shown that morphine can be given for neuropathic pain.
Yeah, opioids are second or third choice for treating neuropathic pain.
But methadone is useful for neuropathic pain. But things like morphine can be used like a third choice or something.
Anybody have any more comments or questions?
If the hypothenar and the thenar wasting was not there, probably a short course of steroids would help. If it is, because usually we get patients like that. I work with my husband's a rheumatologist. We have a rheumatology center. So we use short tapering dose of steroids for relieving the edema, and they do well actually.
Yes, yes, definitely. Even for lumbar disc, no? Sudden onset lumbar disc, you can give steroid a short course. It's really beneficial.
It's very, very beneficial. And rest and then gradual exercises, some physiotherapy, they really do well.
How long can you give morphine? Sorry. Can I ask a question? How long can you give morphine?
Yes.
Continuously for how many days?
Sunil, are you taking the question?
Okay. So in case of non-cancer pain, first of all, you have to actually assess the risk-benefit ratio. So even if you prescribe morphine, the dose should not be increased very fast, and after 10 milligram 4 hourly. And even at every review, you have to assess with morphine, are you actually causing more harm to the patient or benefit to the patient? So this need to be done at every review. That's very important. Because sometimes patient might be taking the opioid and there is not much benefit. In such case, you have to stop it also. The important thing is you can continue, but you have to assess the risk-benefit ratio of giving, not only in case of opioids, but also in any other, if you give any medication, you have to assess this. But in case of suppose with the physiotherapy and strengthening exercise, sometimes if the patient pain is getting better, you can try to decrease the dose of the morphine and if possible, gradually stop it, gradually taper it and stop. Yeah, in case of malignancy, usually patients, the pain producing stimulus like tumor or nerve infiltration, if they are undergoing any treatment, then there is a possibility that the pain may get reduced. But if those patients who has an advanced disease or progressive disease, the stimulus for the pain will be there. So you will not be able to stop opioids and you have to continue with that.
And what would be the side effect that you would be most worried about other than the respiratory?
No, actually, we are not looking at the respiratory depression because it is not a common side effect or toxic effect. Even though it is described in textbooks, you can definitely it can produce respiratory depression if you use it in very high doses. That is, which is not required for that patient. So the usual, actually, the next class is on this, but the thing which we are worried about, especially in non-cancer patients, would be the psychological dependence.
2.5 milligram morphine tablets, is it available like 2.5
No.
milligram tablets?
Now
Morphine.
in Kerala, we have only 10 milligram, 20 milligram and 50 milligram tablets. But in RCC, they have RCC Trivandrum, they have 5 milligram capsules and syrup also. But otherwise, all the other palliative care centers has 10 milligram, 20 milligram and 50 milligram tablets.
Then we are getting 10 milligram tablets. So very difficult to give, prescribe 2.5 milligram tablets. So very difficult to cut it into pieces, like very small tablet.
Yeah, it is difficult. But if you think that this patient need 2.5 milligram, either you have to ask them to cut it or make it a powder and divide the into two half and ask them to take half of it.
What about constipation, sir? Is that a major
Yeah, that's
problem?
most common side effect. We will talk about this in the next class. Next class is
Okay,
on
okay.
opioids,
Thank
strong
you.
opioids.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Ma'am, in steroids, can we use Omnacotil prednisolone instead of Dexa, or Dexa is preferred choice in case of cervical prolapse or lumbar disc or any edema?
Omnacotil contains what?
Prednisolone.
Prednisolone.
Omnacotil is prednisolone.
We usually use either prednisolone or methylprednisolone. Prednisolone also works well. Yeah, prednisolone works better than dexamethasone. I think in our practice we use it.
But in intracranial tumors and all, we are using dexamethasone. And Medrol. Medrol is also.
Medrol is methylprednisolone. Methylprednisolone, actually dexamethasone has less mineralocorticoid activity. So it has, it will produce less fluid and water retention. So that's why it is being commonly used in to reduce the increased intracranial tension. Anybody else? Okay, for this patient, we understand that because of the short notice, there are some details not available. So we have to have a detailed history and the pain assessment in this patient. Then probably investigations also. And we have to establish a diagnosis, then next exercises, and pain medications, analgesics to treat the pain, maybe adjuvants, and as per the severity, we have to choose maybe opioid also. And maybe a short course of steroid might be beneficial also. But this patient, it is long term, but also it is 8 month history of 8 months history, so I'm not sure.